so, used to the world of mortgages, credit cards, online banking. It really shapes how we live. It
Hmm.
makes you wonder, did anything even close to this exist way, way back? So, today we're diving into what seems like a simple question. Did ancient China have banks?
Right. And the answer we've uncovered, well, it would just surprise you.
Okay.
We've got some really interesting sources here digging into the early history of what we might call banking in China.
Right.
And this material, it looks at some truly unexpected places where financial stuff started happening centuries ago.
So our mission today.
Is basically to explore this history, reveal this perhaps surprising financial world of ancient China.
Okay, let's get right into it then, because the sources, they immediately paint a very different picture. I mean, forget grand marble buildings, right?
Yeah, forget the vaults for a minute.
In ancient China, it seems the functions we associate with banks, they were happening in all sorts of places. Temples,
Yeah,
inns.
even cloth shops and pharmacies.
Yeah, it's a totally different way to think about it.
It really is. And it's important to be clear. These weren't, formal regulated banks like we understand them today. Not at all.
Okay.
Instead, these were like established parts of the community that just because of their role and credibility, they naturally started fulfilling these essential banking functions
Yeah.
to meet local needs.
And when you say banking functions, what exactly are we talking about? Holding money.
Yeah, holding deposits securely,
Mm-hmm.
lending money with interest, making payments easier like remittances,
Right.
and even issuing forms of credit, things that could circulate like money.
And that pharmacy example is, well, it's really compelling, especially with that personal story in our sources. Your mother's family pharmacy, a long-standing place, so trusted, so financially sound back in the 30s and 40s that its own bills were used as local currency. That really makes it concrete.
It absolutely does. It just highlights how critical trust and, reputation were in these early financial setups.
Yeah.
This pharmacy, it wasn't just about medicine. It was like a vital part of the community.
Yeah. A hub.
Exactly. And because it had built up all this credibility over years, people felt safe taking its bills as payment. Then that financial strength let it branch out, handling deposits, loans, remittances,
All the core bank stuff.
all the core stuff. And the key thing here is that trust built on something else, like healthcare, could naturally grow into financial services. It really shows how community-focused these early economies were.
That makes total sense, especially thinking about rural China. Pharmacies were often central places, right? Deeply connected to people's lives.
Hmm.
And the people running the bigger ones, they were often respected locals, maybe gentry, with resources.
Exactly. Withstanding in the community made them sort of natural candidates to extend credit and manage finances.
Okay.
And this isn't just like a 20th century thing. Our sources even go back to the Tang Dynasty. They mention the Taiping Guanji.
Which is a big collection of stories from back then.
Yeah, huge collection. And apparently, even then, powerful pharmacies were taking deposits, making loans, and letting people withdraw
Yeah.
using, well, basically early banknotes. Notes.
The parallels are pretty striking.
They really are.
Okay, so speaking of parallels, the sources then shift to temple banks, another really fascinating area. It seems temples as early banks wasn't just a China thing.
That's right. It happened elsewhere too. But in China, particularly during the southern and northern dynasties, Buddhism got a lot of imperial support.
Right, lots of donations.
Exactly. Temples ended up with substantial wealth. So with all these assets, lending just became feasible, a natural next step almost.
Plus they had networks, right?
Hmm. Bigger temples often had branches, which made them more convenient, maybe safer for people compared to just borrowing from an individual.
So everyone used them, rich and poor.
Yeah. Sources suggest both wealthy people and ordinary folks were willing to use temples for loans, even mortgages. The key takeaway, I think, is that institutions with authority and networks like temples were really well placed to manage money when there wasn't a formal banking system.
And they even had specific names for these operations. Siku, temple storehouses.
Yeah, siku. And later they evolved into changshenku, everlasting storehouses.
Everlasting. That definitely suggests a long-term view of the finance side.
It really does. And this term changshenquan, everlasting money, it reflects this idea that the loan principle was meant to generate income forever, basically. These temple banks got pretty big after the Song Dynasty, quite important players.
But then they declined.
Yeah, it shows how tied finance was to bigger shifts. The sources mention the Yuan Dynasty suppressing Han Buddhism, and then Confucianism becoming more dominant in the Ming and Qing.
And that pushed the temples out of the finance game.
It seems to have led to their decline as major financial players, yes. It shows how linked these things were: politics, religion, finance.
And the comparison to the West is interesting, too. The Temple of Athena in ancient Greece, 5th century BC, functioning like a central bank.
Yeah, and a national treasury, too. The amount of coin they apparently had stored before the Peloponnesian War, it's staggering.
And actual banking stalls around the temple.
Right, and they've even found these stone tables, the trapeza, which, is where the Greek word for bank comes from.
No way.
Yeah, complete with scales, calculation marks. You can really picture the activity.
So why temples? What was the common factor, East and West?
Well, two main things seem to pop up. One, just high foot traffic. Temples were central gathering places.
There were lots of potential customers.
Exactly. And two, the role of religion itself in sort of endorsing credit, building trust. In societies without formal contracts everywhere, that religious authority must have counted for a lot.
That makes sense. Do you think the reasons temples got into finance were the same, though? Or were there maybe subtle differences between, say, China and Greece?
That's a really good question. I mean, accumulating wealth was key in both places, obviously. But the specific context probably shaped things. In China, maybe the Buddhist ideals of charity or helping the community played a role in the lending.
Whereas in Greece, maybe it was more about the temple being a civic treasury, a state function almost.
Possibly. Yeah, that seems plausible. Definitely something interesting to dig into more. But moving on, our sources then look at another way these early banks popped up: through trade. Commercial circulation.
Okay, this feels a bit more like the story we sometimes hear about European banking origins, right? Merchants needing finance.
Exactly. With trade growing, especially in the Tang Dynasty, Tianjin was this huge international city.
Right.
The need for better ways to manage money for travelers, merchants, it just became critical. And that led to some really clever solutions.
Like those liaison offices. Liaison offices.
Yeah, set up by different regions, kind of like embassies or state offices in the capital today. They weren't just for communication. They were vital for remittances.
Because carrying metal coins was a nightmare.
Totally. Risky, heavy, impractical over long distances. So they developed flying money, fikain.
Ah, the flying money.
Yeah. Think of it like an early traveler's check. You deposit cash in one office.
And get a voucher.
Exactly. A voucher you could take back home or to another major city and redeem it for cash there. Very early remote banking.
That's ingenious. And it wasn't just officials doing this. Inns got involved too.
Initially, inns just offered storage for traveler stuff, these gifang cabinet workshops. Safe storage.
Okay.
But that quite naturally grew into accepting deposits, letting people withdraw funds. The text even compares it to like modern bank branches or ATMs in China's busy West Market.
It's amazing how similar the function feels centuries apart.
Isn't it? And then you've got the big cloth shops.
Right, because cloth itself was currency.
Yeah, especially silk. In the Tang Dynasty, they had this parallel standard of money and silk. Both coins and textiles were official money.
I remember reading about that.
So naturally, big shops dealing in cloth, which was basically wealth, also started handling deposits, making loans, acting as financial go-betweens using this widely accepted commodity. There's that poem reference, the old charcoal seller, that really shows how normal paying in silk was.
So all of this, it really messes with the standard history lesson, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
The sources really push back on that simple idea: Europe equals goldsmiths, China pawn shops.
Yeah, they directly challenge that. They present a much richer, more varied picture of how finance actually developed.
It wasn't so linear.
Not at all.
Yeah.
The sources argue that banking, or at least its basic functions, is probably almost as old as private property itself.
Or lending.
Once you have stuff, and people need to borrow stuff.
Some kind of financial middleman role is almost bound to appear, right?
Okay, so looking across all these different examples, the pharmacies, temples, offices, inns, cloth shops, what's the common thread? What makes them early banks? Well, a few things stand out. First, location, 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 kind of. They were all in places with lots of people and lots of money moving around.
High traffic, high flow.
Yep. That gives you the customers in the capital.
Yeah.
Second, they were mostly local. Building that crucial trust, that credibility, it takes time. And it happens best within a community you know.
Makes sense.
And finally, just strong personal interactions, knowing people, having relationships. That was vital for building the credit networks that any kind of banking relies on.
It's fascinating how those basic principles, well, they still kind of hold true today, don't they? Even with global finance.
They really do.
Yeah.
In modern banking, obviously with its huge networks, has overcome a lot of the old geographical limits.
Yeah.
But even now, you still see the importance of local community banks, credit unions. They often thrive precisely because they focus on those same ideas. Community connection, local trust.
So the core needs haven't changed that much.
It seems the evolution from these really diverse ancient forms to the institutions we have now has followed these fundamental human and societal needs for trust, access, and ways to manage resources.
So the big takeaway for you listening is probably this. Banking in ancient China wasn't this single straightforward thing we might imagine.
Not at all.
It was this surprisingly diverse landscape. You had temples, pharmacies, inns, all sorts of places stepping up to fill these essential financial roles in their communities. It really makes you rethink the history of finance, doesn't it?
It really does. And maybe it leaves us and you with a final thought to chew on.
Okay.
How have those core elements, trust, community, that were so absolutely central to these early forms of finance, how have they adapted or maybe changed in our world today, this super digital globalized world?
Are those fundamental things changing? We're just showing up in new ways.
Exactly. Definitely something to ponder long after we finish this deep dive. If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.